Nithari was a small village located near Sector 31 in Noida, Uttar Pradesh. It existed in the shadow of a rapidly developing city, surrounded by high-rise buildings, shopping complexes, and affluent residential areas. The people of Nithari were mostly daily wage workers, domestic helpers, construction laborers, and street vendors. Their lives were simple, difficult, and largely invisible to the rest of the city. Complaints from this area rarely carried weight, and voices from the village were often ignored by authorities. In late 2005, something disturbing began to happen. Children from Nithari started going missing. At first, it was just one child, then another. A young boy disappeared while playing outside. A few weeks later, a young girl failed to return home. These incidents did not immediately raise alarm at the institutional level. In poor neighborhoods, missing children were often assumed to have run away, migrated for work, or wandered off. The families reported the disappearances to the local police station, but their concerns were routinely dismissed. Parents were told to wait. They were told their children would return. Some were told their children had probably gone to work in nearby cities. Formal investigations were rarely initiated. Missing persons reports were either delayed or poorly documented. Each disappearance was treated as an isolated incident, never as part of a larger pattern. As months passed, the number of missing children increased. By mid-2006, dozens of families in and around Nithari were searching for sons and daughters who had vanished without explanation. The ages of the missing children varied, but many were between 6 and 14 years old. Some teenage girls also disappeared. The fear in the community grew steadily, but it remained contained within the village. No major media outlet reported on it. No senior official intervened. Life in Nithari continued under a cloud of anxiety. Parents became cautious, but poverty offered little choice. Children were still sent outside to fetch water, collect scrap, or run small errands. Many families depended on these small contributions for survival. The disappearances did not stop. Close to the village stood a large bungalow known as D5, located in Sector 31 in Noida. It was separated from Nithari by walls, roads, and an invisible social divide. The house belonged to Moninder Singh Pandher, a businessman who spent much of his time outside Noida. The property was well maintained, guarded, and noticeably different from the surrounding homes. Pandher employed a domestic servant named Surinder Kohli, who was frequently present at the house. To the villagers, D5 was just another rich man's residence. It did not attract suspicion. Wealthy homes in Noida were common, and domestic workers came and went regularly. There was no reason, at least on the surface, to connect the disappearances in Nithari to a bungalow in a neighboring sector. Behind the D5 bungalow ran a drainage channel. It was part of the city's sewage system, carrying waste away from residential areas. People passed by it daily. During certain seasons, foul odors were common, and complaints about smell were not unusual in that area. Nothing about the drain seemed extraordinary at the time. By late 2006, the disappearances reached a critical point. The number of missing children could no longer be ignored by the families. Protests began to form. Parents gathered outside police stations demanding answers. Some approached local journalists. Pressure slowly started to build, though still without urgency from authorities. In December 2006, the disappearance of a teenage girl changed everything. Her family refused to accept delays or excuses. They demanded an immediate search. This time, the case began to draw media attention. Reporters arrived in Nithari. Questions were asked publicly. Under mounting pressure, the police initiated a more thorough investigation in the area. During the search operations, attention turned toward the drainage area behind the D5 bungalow. What began as a routine search quickly turned into a horrifying discovery. Human remains were found in the drain. The remains were small, fragmented, and unmistakably belonged to children. The discovery shocked the investigating officers. Further searches revealed more remains, bones, skull fragments, clothing pieces. It became clear that this was not a single incident. The remains indicated multiple victims. The scale of the crime began to emerge, and the reality was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. News of the discovery spread rapidly. Media coverage intensified. The quiet disappearances of Nithari were suddenly national headlines. Families who had been ignored for months were now being interviewed. The police, under scrutiny, sealed off the area. Forensic teams were called in. The drain and the surrounding land became a crime scene. Attention immediately focused on the D5 bungalow. Its proximity to the discovery site raised serious questions. Investigators entered the premises. What they found inside would soon form the basis of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Indian history. The discovery of human remains near the drainage channel behind the D5 bungalow transformed the Nithari case overnight. What had once been dismissed as routine missing persons complaints now became a crime scene of national importance. Police sealed off the area, restricting public access as forensic teams began a systematic search. Each new recovery from the drain deepened the gravity of the situation. The remains were not from a single victim. They belonged to many children. As forensic examinations progressed, investigators found skull fragments, bones, hair, clothing pieces, and personal items scattered in and around the drain. Some remains were buried shallowly, others exposed by sewage flow. The condition of the remains made identification difficult, but families from Nithari began recognizing clothing and accessories. The realization was devastating. Parents who had waited months for answers now faced the possibility that their children had been murdered. Media presence intensified rapidly. Television crews broadcast images from outside the sealed bungalow. Newspapers carried front-page headlines describing the discoveries. Public outrage grew as questions emerged about how so many children could disappear from a single area without intervention. Attention turned sharply toward law enforcement, particularly the local police, whose earlier inaction was now impossible to justify. Investigators entered the D5 bungalow in detail. Inside the house, they searched every room, storage area, and utility space. Items were seized for forensic analysis. The focus soon shifted to the people associated with the house. Surinder Kohli, the domestic servant employed at the bungalow, was taken into custody for questioning. His behavior and statements raised immediate suspicion. During interrogation, Surinder Kohli reportedly made statements that led investigators deeper into the case. Based on official records, his disclosures pointed toward the involvement of the D5 premises in the crimes. Police also detained Moninder Singh Pander, the owner of the bungalow, who had returned from abroad after learning about the investigation. Both men were now under scrutiny. As questioning continued, investigators expanded the search area. More remains were recovered from the drain and nearby locations. Forensic teams worked continuously, cataloging each fragment. DNA analysis was initiated to match remains with families of missing children. The scale of the crimes became clearer with every passing day. This was not an isolated act, but a prolonged series of killings. Public anger intensified as details emerged. Protesters gathered outside police stations and government offices. Demonstrations erupted in Noida and other cities. People demanded accountability not only from the accused, but also from the system that had failed to act despite repeated complaints. The case was no longer just about crime. It had become a symbol of institutional neglect. The Central Bureau of Investigation was brought in due to the sensitivity and magnitude of the case. The transfer itself raised serious questions about the initial handling of the investigation. Files were reviewed,
timelines reconstructed, and missing person reports re-examined. It became evident that warnings had existed long before the discovery of the remains. Families recounted how they had repeatedly approached the police. Many had named the same area where their children were last seen. Some had even expressed suspicion about the vicinity of the D5 bungalow. These concerns were never pursued seriously. The failure to connect the cases earlier became one of the most criticized aspects of the investigation. As the inquiry deepened, forensic reports confirmed that the remains belonged to multiple children of different ages. The manner in which the bodies were disposed of suggested deliberate attempts to conceal the crimes. The drainage channel had been used repeatedly over an extended period. This indicated planning and familiarity with the area. The arrests of Surinder Kohli and Moninder Singh Pandher were followed by formal charges. The allegations included kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of minors. The gravity of the charges shocked the nation. News coverage became continuous, with expert panels debating how such crimes could occur in a densely populated urban area without detection. Meanwhile, the victims' families faced a different reality. For them, media attention did not bring relief. Identification of remains was slow and painful. Many parents waited weeks or months for confirmation. Some never received complete remains, only fragments. Funerals were held without closure, and grief was compounded by anger and betrayal. The investigation also revealed significant procedural lapses. Evidence had been compromised due to delayed action. Some remains were damaged by exposure to sewage and environmental conditions. These issues would later impact the legal proceedings. Critics argued that earlier intervention could have preserved critical evidence and possibly saved lives. Government officials made public statements promising justice. Compensation for affected families was announced. Senior police officers were suspended or transferred. These measures, however, did little to erase the perception that the system had acted only after the crimes became impossible to ignore. By early 2007, the Nithari case had become one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in India. Every development was scrutinized. Court proceedings were anticipated with intense public interest. The focus shifted from discovery to accountability, from shock to the pursuit of punishment. Yet beneath the headlines and protests, one question remained unresolved. How many victims were there in total? The exact number was still uncertain. As investigators continued their work, the nation waited, aware that the full truth of Nithari had not yet been revealed. The case was far from over. What lay ahead would involve confessions, court trials, and reversals, and years of legal battles. The horror uncovered in the drain was only the beginning of a long and complex journey toward justice.
As the investigation moved forward, the focus shifted from discovery to legal responsibility. With Surinder Kohli and Moninder Singh Pandher in custody, law enforcement agencies began building formal cases. Statements recorded during interrogation became central to the prosecution's narrative. According to official records, Surinder Kohli made multiple confessional statements describing his involvement in the crimes. These confessions would later become both the strongest and most controversial elements of the case. Based on these statements, investigators reconstructed a timeline of events spanning several months. The crimes were alleged to have occurred repeatedly, targeting children and young women from vulnerable backgrounds. The proximity of the victims' homes to the D5 bungalow was emphasized, as was the pattern of disappearances that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The prosecution argued that the crimes showed consistency and intent, not randomness. Moninder Singh Pandher, as the owner of the bungalow, was questioned extensively. He denied direct involvement, but was accused of being aware of the activities occurring on his property. Investigators examined travel records, phone logs, and witness statements to determine his presence during key periods. The question of whether he was complicit or negligent became one of the most debated aspects of the case.
Multiple first information reports were filed, each corresponding to a different victim. This resulted in dozens of separate cases, all linked to the same location and accused individuals. The scale of the legal process was unprecedented. Courts had to manage a volume of evidence that included forensic reports, DNA analysis, confessional statements, recovered items, and testimony from victims' families. Forensic science played a critical role, but it also highlighted the consequences of delayed action. Many remains were incomplete or degraded, making identification difficult. DNA matching was possible in some cases, but not all. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence to connect the victims to the accused. Defense attorneys would later challenge the reliability of this evidence. As the trials began, public attention intensified once again. Courtrooms were crowded with journalists, activists, and families seeking justice. Each hearing was closely reported. The confessions attributed to Surinder Kohli were read aloud in court, sending shockwaves through the audience. However, the defense raised immediate objections, arguing that the confessions were coerced and therefore unreliable. This legal challenge became a turning point. Indian law requires strict standards for admissibility of confessions, especially those made in police custody. The courts were tasked with determining whether due process had been followed. Medical examinations, interrogation timelines, and procedural records were scrutinized in detail. Despite these challenges, lower courts initially delivered strong judgments. Surinder Kohli was convicted in multiple cases and sentenced to death for several murders. The verdicts were seen by many as a decisive step toward justice. Families of victims expressed relief, though it was tempered by years of suffering and loss. Moninder Singh Ponher's legal journey followed a different path. In some cases, courts ruled that evidence against him was insufficient. In others, he faced ongoing proceedings. The differing outcomes fueled public debate. Many questioned how crimes of such magnitude could occur in a private residence without the owner's knowledge. Others emphasized the legal principle that guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. As appeals were filed, the case moved to higher courts. The legal process slowed significantly. Years passed between hearings. Evidence was re-examined, testimonies reassessed, and procedural lapses highlighted. Some convictions were upheld, while others were overturned due to lack of conclusive proof. These reversals reignited public anger. For many, the Nithari case was no longer just about crime and punishment, but about systemic failure. Questions resurfaced about the initial police response, the handling of evidence, and the treatment of victims' families. Each acquittal or reduced sentence felt like a reopening of old wounds. Throughout this period, families remained caught in legal uncertainty. Some continued to attend court hearings year after year. Compensation provided by the government helped with survival, but it could not replace closure. For many parents, the absence of definitive answers was as painful as the loss itself. The media narrative evolved also. Early coverage focused on horror and shock. Later reporting shifted toward legal complexity and accountability. Investigative reports exposed gaps in child protection mechanisms and criticized police practices. The case became a reference point in discussions about missing children across the country. By the time the trials reached advanced stages, the Nithari case had already altered public consciousness. It influenced policy discussions, police procedures, and judicial scrutiny of custodial confessions. It also highlighted how marginalized communities often struggle to be heard until tragedy becomes undeniable. Yet, despite convictions, acquittals, and appeals, a sense of incompleteness remained. The exact number of victims was still debated. Not all families received definitive identification, and the question of whether earlier action could have prevented further loss lingered unanswered. As the legal battles continued, one thing became clear. The impact of Nithari extended far beyond the courtroom. It had exposed uncomfortable truths about inequality, neglect, and accountability. The story was no longer confined to Noida. It had become a national reckoning. The next phase of the case would test the limits of the justice system even further. Higher court decisions, long delays, and final outcomes would determine how history ultimately judged Nithari, not just as a crime, but as a failure that demanded change.
As the Nithari case moved into the appellate stage, the focus shifted once again, this time from the brutality of the crimes to the strength of the legal process itself. What had seemed like decisive convictions in the lower courts were now subjected to intense scrutiny by higher judicial authorities. Every piece of evidence, every statement, and every procedural step taken during the investigation was re-examined in detail. Surinder Kohli's death sentences in multiple cases were automatically referred to higher courts as required by law. Defense lawyers challenged the validity of the confessions that had formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. They argued that the statements were obtained during police custody and were therefore legally questionable. Medical records, interrogation timelines, and witness accounts were presented to suggest that due process may not have been strictly followed. The appellate courts acknowledged the disturbing nature of the crimes, but emphasized a fundamental legal principle. Convictions must rest on legally admissible and reliable evidence. In several cases, the courts noted gaps in forensic linkage, inconsistencies in recovery procedures, and the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. These observations did not deny that crimes had occurred, but they raised serious concerns about whether the prosecution had met the required standard of proof. As a result, some convictions were upheld while others were overturned. In certain cases, death sentences were commuted or set aside due to insufficient evidence. Each such decision triggered strong public reactions. Families of victims expressed anguish and disbelief. For them, legal technicalities felt like barriers to justice rather than safeguards of fairness. Muninder Singh Pandher's appeals followed a similar trajectory, but with different outcomes. In multiple cases, higher courts ruled that the evidence against him was circumstantial and did not conclusively establish his involvement. Over time, he was acquitted in several cases. These acquittals intensified criticism of the investigation, particularly regarding the failure to establish clear accountability beyond the confessions of the domestic servant. The legal setbacks prompted renewed examination of the original investigation. Analysts and former officials pointed out that crucial evidence might have been lost or contaminated due to delays in securing the crime scene. The drainage area had been exposed to environmental elements for months before forensic recovery began. This significantly weakened the evidentiary chain. Another major issue highlighted during appeals was the handling of missing persons reports. Court records showed that several families had filed complaints long before the discovery of the remains. These reports were either not properly recorded or not acted upon. The courts took note of this systemic failure, though it did not directly influence individual verdicts. The prolonged legal process also took a psychological toll on the victims' families. Many had attended court hearings for years, reliving their trauma repeatedly. Each new judgment brought either fleeting hope or renewed despair. The promise of justice made during the early days of the investigation seemed increasingly distant. Public discourse around the Nithari case began to change. While initial outrage had focused on the accused, later discussions emphasized institutional accountability. Activists, legal experts, and journalists questioned how law enforcement failures could undermine even the most serious prosecutions. The case became a cautionary example of how poor investigation can weaken justice regardless of the severity of the crime. Government authorities responded with policy-level measures. Guidelines for handling missing children cases were revisited. Police procedures were updated to ensure faster registration and investigation of such complaints. While these reforms were presented as lessons learned from Nithari, critics argued that they came too late for the victims. Media coverage also evolved during this period.
Sensational headlines gave way to detailed legal analysis. Long-form reports examined the interplay between evidence, confessions, and judicial standards. The narrative became more complex, reflecting the difficulty of balancing public outrage with the rule of law. Despite acquittals and reversals, the courts did not dismiss the suffering of the victims. Judgments acknowledged the tragedy and the failures that allowed it to continue unchecked. However, acknowledgement did not translate to complete closure. For many families, justice felt fragmented and incomplete. By the time the appeals reached their advanced stages, the Nithari case had already spanned more than a decade. What began as ignored disappearances had turned into one of the longest and most painful legal sagas in the country. The delays themselves became part of the story, highlighting how time can erode both evidence and public trust. The question of responsibility extended beyond individuals to institutions. Police departments, administrative bodies, and oversight mechanisms were all scrutinized. The case forced a national conversation about whose duty it is to protect the most vulnerable and what happens when that duty is neglected. As the legal chapter moved closer to its final phase, one truth became unavoidable. No verdict could fully undo the damage caused by years of neglect and delay. The Nithari case had already left a permanent mark on the country's conscience. What remained was the legacy of the case, how it would be remembered, what it would change, and whether its lessons would prevent future tragedies. The final part of the story would not focus on courts alone, but on the broader impact that Nithari had on society and the justice system itself.
As the legal proceedings stretched on, the Nithari case gradually shifted from active courtroom drama to a lasting national memory. Even when hearings were postponed or verdicts delayed, the case continued to resurface in public discussions, academic studies, and media retrospectives. Nithari was no longer just a location in Noida. It had become a symbol of how easily vulnerable lives could be overlooked. For the families of the victims, time did not heal in the usual sense. Years after the initial discoveries, many parents continued to live in the same neighborhood, passing the same streets where their children were last seen. Some families relocated, unable to remain in a place so closely tied to loss. Others stayed, driven by economic necessity and the hope that their persistence would keep the memory of their children alive. Government compensation, announced early in the case, provided temporary financial relief but could not address the deeper trauma. Counseling services were limited and inconsistent. For many families, the emotional burden was compounded by the feeling that their suffering had become part of a prolonged legal and media process rather than a resolved tragedy. Public awareness of missing children increased significantly in the years following Nithari. Media outlets began reporting such cases more prominently. Non-governmental organizations used the case to highlight systemic gaps in child protection and law enforcement response. Nithari was frequently cited in discussions about the need for early intervention and coordinated tracking of missing persons. Policy changes followed, though gradually. Guidelines were reinforced requiring immediate registration of missing child reports as cognizable cases. Police departments were instructed to treat every missing child complaint with urgency. Databases for missing children were expanded, and coordination between states was emphasized. While these measures existed in some form before, Nithari underscored the cost of not enforcing them effectively. Training programs for law enforcement personnel were updated to include sensitivity towards marginalized communities. The assumption that children from poor families had run away or migrated for work was formally challenged. The case highlighted how bias and class divisions could influence investigatory priorities, often with devastating consequences. In public discourse, Nithari also raised difficult questions about urban inequality. The crimes occurred in the shadow of affluence, where wealth and poverty existed side by side, but rarely intersected in accountability.
Commentators pointed out how the social distance between the village and surrounding residential sectors contributed to prolonged neglect. The physical proximity of the crimes contrasted sharply with the emotional and institutional distance that allowed them to continue. The media's role was re-examined as well. Early silence was followed by intense coverage once the remains were discovered. Journalists later reflected on how sustained reporting might have altered the course of events if attention had come earlier. Nithari became a case study in the power and limits of media intervention. Educational institutions and legal forums began referencing the case when discussing criminal procedure, evidence handling, and custodial confessions. Law students analyzed judgments to understand how procedural lapses could override moral certainty. The case demonstrated how justice depends not only on uncovering truth, but on preserving it through lawful means. Despite these broader impacts, a sense of incompletion persisted. Many victims were never conclusively identified. Some families continued to live without certainty about their children's fate. This unresolved aspect became part of the case's legacy, reminding the public that justice delayed and justice diluted are not the same as justice denied, but they are deeply connected. Memorialization of the victims remained limited. There were no major public monuments or national remembrance days. Instead, memory survived through anniversaries marked by families, activists, and occasional media reports. The absence of formal remembrance itself became a quiet commentary on how societies move on from tragedy without fully honoring those lost. Over time, new generations learned about Nithari not through daily headlines, but through documentaries, investigative books, and discussions about criminal justice reform. The story was retold in different formats, each emphasizing different lessons. Some focused on crime, others on governance, and some on social responsibility. For policymakers, Nithari served as a reminder that laws and guidelines are only as effective as their implementation. The case illustrated how administrative failure can magnify criminal harm. It also showed that once evidence is lost and trust is broken, no legal outcome can fully restore what was taken. As years passed, the legal status of the accused continued to evolve, but public attention gradually waned. What remained was a collective understanding that Nithari was not an isolated aberration, but a warning about what happens when warnings themselves are ignored. The story, however, was not finished. Its final chapter lay in how it would be remembered and whether its lessons would endure beyond policy documents and court judgments. The last part would confront that question directly, examining what Nithari ultimately means for the nation and for the idea of justice itself.
The Nithari case reached its final legal and public phase not with a single defining verdict, but with a series of judgments spread across years. By the time the highest courts delivered their conclusions in various connected cases, the shock that once dominated headlines had long faded. What remained was a quieter, more unsettling reality. The case had ended without a sense of absolute resolution. From a legal standpoint, the outcomes were mixed. Some convictions were upheld, others were overturned, and several charges could not be sustained due to lack of admissible evidence. The courts emphasized that their role was not to respond to public anger, but to assess proof within the framework of law. This distinction, though legally necessary, was emotionally devastating for families who believed the truth was already clear. Surinder Kohli remained at the center of the case's final judgments, while Moninder Singh Pandher was acquitted in multiple matters due to insufficient evidence. These outcomes intensified long-standing debates about accountability, power, and procedural integrity. For many observers, the contrast between moral certainty and legal certainty became the most difficult aspect to accept. Beyond individual verdicts, the Nithari case exposed how fragile justice becomes when early warnings are ignored.
The most critical failures occurred not in courtrooms, but in police stations where repeated complaints were dismissed. These moments of neglect allowed crimes to continue unchecked. By the time the system responded, the damage was irreversible. In this sense, Nithari became less about who was punished and more about what was missed. Each delayed report, each ignored family, and each unrecorded complaint represented a lost opportunity for prevention. The case forced institutions to confront the consequences of treating some lives as less urgent than others. Public trust in law enforcement and the justice system suffered lasting damage. Even as reforms were announced, skepticism remained. Many questioned whether similar cases in marginalized communities would receive timely attention, or whether Nithari would be remembered only because its horror eventually became impossible to hide. At the same time, the case did lead to measurable changes. Missing children protocols were strengthened, databases and interagency coordination improved, police training increasingly emphasized sensitivity and urgency in such cases. These reforms, while imperfect, were direct responses to the failures revealed by Nithari. Yet structural inequality persisted. The conditions that made Nithari possible, poverty, invisibility, and unequal access to justice, did not disappear. The case served as a reminder that laws alone cannot protect those whom society chooses not to see. For the families, closure remained elusive. Legal endings did not align with emotional endings. Many parents continued to live with unanswered questions, not only about how their children died, but about why their voices were ignored for so long. Their grief existed outside the boundaries of verdicts and appeals. As years passed, Nithari's place in public memory became uncertain. It was remembered during anniversaries, referenced in debates, and cited in policy discussions, but rarely confronted in full. The absence of sustained remembrance reflected a broader tendency to move forward without fully reckoning with past failures. In the end, Nithari did not offer a clean conclusion. It offered a warning about what happens when systems fail quietly, when warnings are dismissed, and when justice arrives too late to prevent tragedy. The case demonstrated that the most dangerous failures are often not dramatic, but routine. Nithari remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the country's criminal history, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of how long they went unnoticed. Its true legacy lies not in court records alone, but in the uncomfortable questions it continues to raise about responsibility, equality, and vigilance. The story ends where it began, with ordinary people whose lives were forever changed, and with a system challenged to prove that it has learned from its past. Whether those lessons endure will determine whether Nithari remains only a memory or a turning point that truly changed the future.